Impact Interview is sponsored by the Pocono Mountains, where small-town charm meets big adventures. Book your trip today by visiting PoconoMountains.com.
Welcome back to Nittany Game Week. This week's Impact Interview is a legend in every way, Bob Costas. That's all I really need to say, other than he has more Emmys than the World Series titles of the New York Yankees, 29-27. He's winning on the scoreboard, if we have that correct. Bob, thanks so much. First and foremost, Happy New Year. And we're so happy that one of your New Year's resolutions was to make an appearance on Nittany Game Week. We couldn't be more honored.
Yeah, as December unfolded and I thought about the things that I need to check off my bucket list or adjust about my life, one of the things that popped up was I got to get together with Todd and Jay. So now we're checking that box, which is a great relief to me.
Thanks again so much. And look, we're going to take you back to where the roots for maybe these college football playoffs go. And it's the Fiesta Bowl, naming's corporate sponsor, November 86, they're talking about it. They upped the payout, moved the game to January 2nd, and landed Penn State and Miami, a game that drew a 25 rating, still the best in college football history. You covered the game. What recollections do you have of it, and how much does the current playoff system maybe owe to that moment?
Well, even in that situation where you had a clear number one and a clear number two, so there wasn't that much dispute, I think a lot of people began to think, wait a minute, isn't there a better way? You know, we don't have to go 28 teams deep or anything like that, but isn't there a better way? So I remember the conversation taking place even then, but there was satisfaction after this one because number one met number two. And Penn State prevailed. And when you look at the stats, and I know, Jay, you're familiar with it, Miami gained more than 400 yards and Penn State had less than 200. And the first downs were like 22-8. But Miami turned the ball over 7 times. And Vinny Testaverde, who won the Heisman that year, threw 5 interceptions in the game, including one right at the end in a last gasp chance to win the game for Miami because the final score is 14-10. So I remember all the buildup too. I remember there was kind of a good guys, bad guys thing, you know, Penn State victory with honor and all that sort of thing, which was essentially true about Penn State. And Miami kind of heightened that narrative by the players showed up in Arizona on their flight. They're wearing like military fatigues or something or other, like they're going into battle. And then guys issued all kinds of crazy. Didn't Warren Sapp say something insane? I forget exactly what it was.
Oh, yeah, Jerome Brown, yeah.
Oh, it's Jerome Brown,
yeah.
Not Warren Sapp. Warren Sapp has enough stupid statements to his name. I don't have to pin that one on him. But yeah, so the whole atmosphere was one of great anticipation. And like you said, they moved the game to prime time. Charlie Jones, the late Charlie Jones, who was a terrific football announcer, college football and NFL. He had been the voice of the Fiesta Bowl for quite a while. And some people thought, well, since this is the battle for number one, they're going to move Dick Enberg and Merlin Olsen to that game. But Dick and Merlin were associated with the Rose Bowl. And NBC made the right decision. You guys stay there, and Charlie Jones will do the game, I think, with Bob Greasy. And I don't know if Jimmy Cefalo was a late ad, but Jimmy, of course, a Penn State guy, was part of NBC Sports then. Really nice guy. I haven't crossed paths with him in quite some time, but he was part of the broadcast. And Ahmad Rashad and I did the pregame, the halftime, and the postgame. But the halftime included an interview from the White House with President Reagan. And Tom Brokaw did a news update. So Tom's sitting right next to me. And now I'm interviewing Reagan. Hey, it's the President of the United States. I'm only 35 years old. I look like I'm 25 years old. And Brokaw's sitting arm's length from me. So I'm pretty nervous doing it. And then Reagan did one of these things that was really endearing for him. But the clock was ticking. And they were going to start the third quarter. And he starts to tell this story about playing the Gipper in the Newt Rockne story and about recreating baseball games when he lived in Des Moines, Iowa, all of which is very endearing, but it's tick, tick, tick. Now, do I jump in there and say, hey, Mr. President, gotta go. Have a nice night. You know, so that actually was the thing I remember most from a broadcasting standpoint. How the hell do I get rid of the President of the United States in this moment?
Well, you know, Bob, as a Penn State trustee now, I've been fairly vocal about the time having arrived for collective bargaining and revenue sharing in big-time college sports. So given the big media payouts that we're seeing, as this playoff unfolds, what are your thoughts about the state of college football and its current, quote, labor arrangement?
This can't be sustained. When people talked about NIL, the original concept I think that most people had in mind is this. Hey, if a sophomore who's a music prodigy has a chance to play in the local symphony where his college is located, no one's going to stop him or her from making money off of that. And so if a big time college player or any college player has an arrangement where a local car dealer wants to pay him to, endorse their car dealership, why shouldn't that player be able to capitalize on that name, image, likeness? And the flip side of that was that I think the Ed O'Bannon suit, former UCLA basketball player, said, wait a minute, this is me on this video game. That's my name. That's my image, my likeness, and I'm not seeing a cent from that. And I think most people sympathize with that. But now it's become something entirely different, where basically you're buying players. You're making them offers to either come to your school or leave the school they're at and come to your school, which may be free enterprise, but it's very chaotic. College football is much more chaotic than the NBA, the NFL, MLB, or the NHL. And I don't know that I have the exact formula, but they've got to kind of reconcile the differing interests here. We know, sadly, that much of college sports has been corrupt for quite some time. But I think some people were willing to live with the corruption, but not now with the chaos. So they've got to come up with something that has some sort of continuity and makes some sense.
Been a proponent of is player safety, and Penn State's 13-2 and looking at the potential of 2 more games. The player safety part of it, are they doing enough to counterbalance this expansion and extension of the season?
Well, and there's also this question. Even for the most dedicated student athlete, which sometimes is a lie and a sham, but does still exist, I'd like to think, even the most dedicated student athlete can't devote all the time that's necessary to even be a passable student with all the travel and the concentration on the games and the practices and all the time that takes. But maybe that ship has completely sailed. The idea that we're going to actually have some sort of balance with integrity between academics and athletics. So there's that. But when it comes to football, the way it's played at the highest levels, and even including in high school, where the contact can be the same or close to the same, you can only make football less dangerous. You cannot make it completely safe. And I think that message has been absorbed by the NFL and by other levels of football, where there's a better understanding of what concussion protocols should be, what return to play should be, what kind of medical personnel you need to have on the sidelines, that sort of thing. But you can never make the game completely safe.
So in your career, you've covered some of the greatest athletes in the history of sport in this country, many of them household names. Are there other athletes you've covered that maybe weren't household names that stick out in your mind?
Well, that's an interesting question. You make friendships along the way. Many of mine in baseball, some in basketball. The nature of what I did for the most part with the NFL was studio hosting. And it didn't do much college football, although the college football I was involved in, the game in 1987 that we talked about, January 2nd, 1987 at the Fiesta Bowl, the Orange Bowl game in early January of 1995 between Miami and Nebraska, which settled the national championship despite protests from Penn State rooters, and Florida State against Notre Dame in, I guess, 1993, which might be the highest rated regular season college football game ever, even to this point. But I didn't have as many close friendships around football as I did in basketball and in baseball. And what you find sometimes is that your best sources are not the people that are at the center. it's assistant coaches, it's coaches in baseball, the first base, the third base coach, it's the scout. Sometimes those people have more time for you, and they're less guarded in what they tell you because they know that it's not going to be quoted everywhere and you don't see them in a press conference setting. So sometimes the people who are not the bold-faced names become your best sources, and in some cases, your friends.
Bob, two of your children have grown up to win Emmys. I know I get a chance to talk to college students and to young people that are interested in the broadcasting world. What was your advice to them as they got started, and what advice would you give to students today?
Well, it's a Wikipedia misnomer about my daughter. My daughter has spent her life in education. She went to Boston College. She was Phi Beta Kappa there. Then she got a master's at Columbia. She's now going for a second master's in education. She taught public school in New York for 10 years. Now she may be transitioning into some sort of administrative role. We'll see when she finishes this second master's. Her brother has had a career in broadcasting, which I'll get to in a second. But my daughter, Taylor, just said, I want to do one thing directly connected to Dad. And so we arranged for her to be part of the 2012 London Olympics. She worked on the news desk. There's always a news desk at an Olympics in case something outside sports, outside the Olympics happens. And so she had that experience for, 6 weeks or whatever it was in the summer of 2012 in London. And what happens when a big production wins an Emmy, usually the network spends whatever it costs to have all the Emmys minted and gives one to everybody. So therefore, Taylor has her one Emmy. But Keith was always immersed in sports from the time he was a little kid. From the time he was 5 or 6 years old, I was taking him to the NBA Finals and to big football games and to the World Series and whatnot. He was almost a fixture around those events to where the players and coaches and managers knew his name. And he absorbed a lot of that stuff. And right out of college, he got a job at the Major League Baseball Network. Obviously, I helped him get that job, but this is the way it went. I said to the people there, give him whatever an entry-level job is. And after I've opened that door for him, he sinks or swims on his own merit. And that's exactly what he's done. He's extremely knowledgeable. He's now worked his way up to full-fledged producer at the Major League Baseball Network. So he produces games. And in the off season, he's on a show called Hot Stove, which is kind of a morning show devoted to baseball that Matt Vasgersian hosts on the Baseball Network. And Keith researches and produces his own segments and delivers them on camera. So I'm very proud of him. But my role in it was, as his dad, he absorbed so much of what I was around because I made him part of it. And then I opened the door at the Major League Baseball Network and I got out of the way and he did the rest himself.
So the old Pittsburgh Pirates fans talk about Bob Prince, the gunner, who called Pirates game for so many years. But at one point, he tried his hand doing hockey for the Penguins, which did not really work out so well. You've called so many sports. What were your keys to preparation as you moved from sport to sport?
Well, when I did hockey, which is the first assignment for which I was paid, the princely sum of $30 a game, and $5 a day meal money on the road when I did the Syracuse Blazers games, 73-74 season. There, my main concern was to learn the rules, to get the terminology to an acceptable level, and then just to memorize names and numbers. Memorize names and numbers, especially in a sport like hockey with line changes on the fly. And with football, you look at that spotting board, and the night before doing a game, actually days before, but especially the night before, you're pacing around the hotel room and trying to rattle off in your own mind every combination, because who knows who's going to be involved in a play. Does the linebacker have to make the tackle? What happens if there's a block punt and a special team guy who you didn't really think would be central to the game scoops up the block punt and now he's running down the sideline? You've got to be able to recognize those players, even the guys lower on the depth chart, instantaneously. You look down at your spotting board for a note about the player, or the spotter is pointing to who made the tackle or who recovered the fumble, the symbol for which is like that. first point to the guy who made the tackle, and then that is the guy who recovered the fumble. But when the play is unfolding in real time, you have to be able to instantaneously recognize who that is. So you go through all these memory things prior to the game. Basketball, easier. Only 10 people on the floor, and you don't even think about their numbers. You recognize them. They go through layup drills if it's not a team that you're familiar with, and you just memorize them as they go through the layup drills before the game, and you can tell by appearance, and usually you're seated courtside or close to it, so you don't need a spotter for that. And baseball, even when they were shifting, they don't do that anymore, but everyone has their own basic position on the field, and you have a lineup card as each of them comes to bat, and you're keeping score of the game. So there, the memorization is less important. And of course, baseball has a different pace than other sports do. So it lends itself more to background and to history and to storytelling in between pitches.
Bob, we're going to dive a little deeper into those Syracuse Blazers Day, if you don't mind, of the EHL, a time that included an intersection with Goldthorpe, the inspiration for Ogie Oglethorpe in the movie Slapshot. Spin a yarn, a tale from those days, and how you got started with that, and just calling hockey and what the game was like at that time.
Yeah, well, Slapshot isn't that much of an exaggeration. There is some dramatic license, but everything that's in that movie, to one extent or another, happened in the old Eastern Hockey League. And almost every hockey player I've ever known, even people that are now in their 20s or 30s, they've seen that movie. It's almost impossible to find someone connected to hockey that hasn't seen Slapshot multiple times and gotten a huge kick out of it. I knew many of the players who were extras in the movie. The movie was written by Nancy Dowd, who is the sister of Ned Dowd, who was a celebrated player, to the extent that minor league players are celebrated, in his town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And Ned played a role in the movie. I don't know that he played Ogie, but he was in the movie. He might actually have played Ogie Oglethorpe. But anyway, that was based, as you said, on an actual player named Bill Harpo Goldthorpe, who played for the Syracuse Blazers and is to this day one of the most fabled enforcers in the history of hockey. By his own account, he was banned from 6 different leagues, including a senior league, like guys that are 48, 50 years old playing in a senior league. He was banned from 6 different leagues. By his own account, he had been arrested more than 40 times. And I think what happened when he came down from wherever he was from in Canada and joined the Blazers, the coach, Ron Ingram, who was a terrific guy, and he had played briefly in the old 6-team NHL, and you had to be pretty good when there were only 6 teams. There were a lot of guys who were career minor league hockey players who would be making a lot of money these days in the NHL, which has now expanded to more than 30 teams. But Ron had played for the Rangers and the Red Wings briefly, a career hockey guy, finds himself in Syracuse. And I think the deal was that he sort of agreed to be kind of take on Goldie as his ward. Like, I'll make sure he stays out of jail and confines his violent tendencies to the rink. And I think that was pretty much a good enough outlet for him, although occasionally a back alley or a barroom brawl, if it was an off night and there wasn't any hockey player to punch, he'd take up that. So the depiction of him in Slapshot is not that much of an exaggeration. Okay, so we start the season in October, November of 73. And Goldie basically evaluated people on the basis of, were they a good hockey player and could they beat people up? And I didn't really pass either of those 2 tests. So I think at the start, he had very little use for me. And there's always an initiation, any rookie. And I mean, it could be a rookie bus driver, it could be a rookie broadcaster, not just a rookie player. There's always some hazing and some initiation you have to go through. So we're on the bus riding to Johnstown, as luck would have it. And I'm reading the New York Times, just sitting, minding my own business, reading the New York Times. But the mere fact that I was holding the New York Times in my hand infuriated him. So he reaches over my shoulder, rips it out of my hands, and then stands up in the aisle of the bus and tears it into multiple pieces and lets it drop on the floor of the bus It flutters down like New Year's Eve confetti. And now I'm looking at him, but so is everybody else on the bus, including the senior players and the coach and the trainer who sat toward the front, and they turn around to see what's happening. And as all this plays out, I'm thinking, I got to do something. I can't let this pass. And I looked up at him and I said, hey, don't be jealous, Goldie. I'll teach you to read, which might have been a good line, but it wasn't the smartest thing to do in that moment, because now he's angrier still. And he yanks me out of my seat, slams me up against the wall of the moving bus. And there was a hacksaw overhead in the rack, which the players used to trim their sticks. So he pulls the hacksaw down and briefly puts it underneath my chin. And I know that he doesn't really intend to decapitate me, but I also know that he isn't the sort of guy that would take into account all the possible dynamics of the situation. What if the bus veers on the road to avoid a deer or hits a pothole? And then who the hell knows what happens, right? So it seemed like an eternity. He probably only had it under there for a few seconds. And then he lets me go. And as this was playing out, the senior players started advancing from the front of the bus like a makeshift SWAT team, going, Goldie, put the hacksaw down, put Bob down, and go sit back down. That was kind of it. But after that, after this little episode, because in some sense I'd stood up for myself, I guess, he was pretty cool with me. And now fast forward decades and decades, and he wrote a memoir. I don't think he wrote it himself, but he wrote a memoir about his incredible exploits in hockey. And he asked me to write the foreword. And I did. So all's well that ends well.
Oh, that's awesome. The hacksaw scene didn't make it to Slapshot, but that would have been that would have been something. And if you don't mind, I wanted to follow up real quick about we broadcast Hershey Bears games, and we love hockey, but the fighting component of the game, as they've tried to move it out, I think people that know hockey know there is a reason why it's in there. But your thoughts on it as they've kind of tried to quell it a little bit, but it still remains a part of what you need to do, the enforcer role.
Yeah, it's part of the game, kind of the ethos of the game. And there's a certain percentage of the hardcore fan base that doesn't just tolerate it, they like it. And I think that those who run hockey at various levels realize that if you completely eliminated it, made the penalties and the consequences so harsh that it would all but eliminate it, that would actually hurt fan appeal if they were honest about it. The NHL has not been as forthright, at least that I'm aware of, about acknowledging the concussion aspect of this, as football has been forced to be. The added attention has forced the NFL and other levels of football to adjust on this. But there are a number of guys who were enforcers and who were involved in a lot of fights who have suffered from CTE down the line. So that's something that, players and the administrators of the sport have to be aware of. In the old Eastern Hockey League, now the Bears were AHL. And I actually visited the arena in which the Hershey Bears play, which is alongside or very nearby the high school arena where Wilt Chamberlain scored his 100 points in 1962. My son Keith and I took a road trip. We stopped in Philadelphia. We saw the Sixers play a game, and we kept on driving to Hershey to see the home of the Hershey Bears and where Wilt had scored his 100 points. So yet we know that minor league hockey, there's kind of there's a different tone about these things. It may not be quite as wild and woolly as the Slapshot days, but there's still, an element of that. You would know better than I because you're around the team on a regular basis. But some of that will always be part of hockey, I think.
Bob, one last question. Penn State has a home and home coming up with Syracuse, a school that I know that is near and dear to your heart, in 2027 and 2028. So it's an old rivalry game that's kind of gone by the wayside in this new era. So in 2027, when Syracuse comes to Penn State, how many tickets do you need, and how much do you miss those Eastern rivalry games?
Oh, I missed it. I go back to when Syracuse played at Archbold Stadium which was then the oldest stadium in use in all of big-time college football. I think it opened like 1909. And, Rip Engel was the coach against Ben Schwartzwalder, but your dad was the coach by the time I got to Syracuse, or maybe he was an assistant coach. What year did he become the head coach at Penn State?
1966.
Oh, yes. Okay, there you go. So he was the head coach. Rip Engel was the coach prior to that. Schwartzwalder was finishing up his legendary run at Syracuse. So there was a Paterno-Schwartzwalder thing going on. How many tickets can you spare? I'm good for the games in Syracuse. Let me, because I know you've got Penn State viewership here. Let me address something else, which involves college football. The 1995, at the conclusion of the 1994 college football season, Orange Bowl game between Nebraska and Miami. Nebraska comes in undefeated and ranked number one in both the AP poll and the coaches poll. Miami is number three. They had lost one game early in the season. And the game's at the Orange Bowl. So in effect, it's a home game for Miami. Miami's a small favorite in the game. Nebraska wins the game 24-17. Penn State, out of the Big Ten, is obligated at that time to play in the Rose Bowl against Oregon, which had lost 2 or 3 games already, and if it was ranked way beneath any of the teams toward the top. So Miami had a chance. If Miami had won that game, they had a chance to finish number one. But Penn State still could have finished number one if Miami won a close game in which they were unimpressive, and then Penn State destroyed Oregon the next day in the Rose Bowl. But that's not what happened. Nebraska, number one in both polls and undefeated, beat Miami. Therefore, nothing, through no fault of their own, that Penn State, which was also undefeated and did beat Oregon the next day, I think it was like 38-20, something like that. But there was no path for Penn State under that system to finish number one. And I said that. I said, in the absence of, I didn't call the game. Tom Hammond called the game, but I was the pregame and halftime and postgame guy. And when it was over, I said, in the absence of a comprehensive playoff system, here's where we are. Nebraska has won the national championship. There's no path for Penn State. It's a damn shame that they can't play head-to-head and that there isn't a better system. But under this system, how is the number one team coming in both polls, number one, beats a formidable opponent, number three, on, in effect, the opponent's home field? How is that team going to relinquish number one when the number two team then beats a team way further down in the rankings on a neutral field? It just couldn't happen. And yet Penn State fans were angry with me, and some are angry to this day, because people, even smart people, even people with PhDs, become irrational when it comes to sports and their team. They define objectivity through the prism of their own crazy fandom. It happens every time to every national broadcaster who calls an NBA Finals, a World Series, a Super Bowl. Fans of both teams hear the exact same words and perceive a bias against their team and for the other team. So now that you have social media, you have people saying, Joe Davis hates the Dodgers and he hates the Yankees at the same time, right? Go figure. So I'm saying this to Penn State fans as nicely as I can. I wish there had been a system by which Tom Osborne's Cornhuskers could have played Joe Paterno's Nittany Lions for the true clear-cut national championship, but it didn't exist. So what I said that night was correct to the comma, no matter how angry you are at me still. And don't you see what a nice guy I am? Come on, don't be mad. I'm a nice guy.
We will do our best to get that message out there as far and as wide as we can, Bob. Thanks so much for the time. We really appreciate it. And look, not only do I emulate, but I hope to replicate the fact that you have been able to stop and maybe even reverse the aging process. So thanks so much for the time. We really appreciate all the great tales.
Good lighting. There's your key. Good lighting.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
Happy New Year, guys.
Same to you, man. Really appreciate it.
All right.